Muy buenos días.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, those who have joined from other points of the region and of the world. We greet everyone from Santiago, Chile, in the central venue of this Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Welcome to this press conference where the annual report of ECLAC, Economic Survey of Latin America and the Caribbean 2024, trap of low growth, climate change, and employment dynamics. It is also being broadcasted virtually in the different digital platforms of ECLAC, like cepal.org, YouTube, and our website, cepal.org, and in X and Facebook. So we greet those who are with us in this Celso Furtado room, particularly the journalists who have registered in order to participate in the launch, either in situ or virtually, and colleagues of ECLAC with us. The presentation of the document will be by the Executive Secretary of ECLAC, Mr. José Manuel Salazar-Xirinachs, and Director of our Economic Division, Daniel Tittelman, who will provide the main conclusions of this report. We are also joined the officials of economic affairs, economic development of ECLAC, a team that has participated in the management of this report. Ramón Pineda, Esteban Pérez, Cristina Corton, Francisco Villarroel, and also the Cabinet Head of the Executive Secretariat, Mrs. Hernandez, and Secretary of the Commission, Luis Yañez. Likewise, we express appreciation for the many directors that are here with us in ECLAC. After the presentation, we'll have a round of questions by the journalists. We remind the media representatives, please send your questions in writing via the chat of the Zoom platform to which you have been connected, or conferenciaprensa@cepal.org at that email. Without further ado, Executive Secretary, you have the floor. Thank you, Guido. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to ECLAC. And it is a great pleasure to be able to present today this version of the Economic Survey of Latin America and the Caribbean. It's number 76 of this year, 2024, entitled Low Growth Trap of Low Growth, Climate Change, and Employment Dynamics. Please, I'd like to start by thanking Daniel Tittelman and the whole team that was already mentioned, all the colleagues that have collaborated in the preparation of this very relevant report. In ECLAC, we see the region within three development traps, as you have heard, that hamper the development of the region. One, low growth capacity, one of high inequality, low social mobility, weak social cohesion, and a third one of low institutional capacity and weak governance. This study refers particularly to the low growth trap and its link with the creation of employment and climate change. The study has two parts. I will summarize the main messages of each one of the parts in a summarized manner in order to give the floor to Daniel Tittelman for a more in-depth presentation. The first part of the survey analyzes or refers to the trap of low growth and possibilities of financial conditions hampering the possibility of leaving the trap behind. The growth is less than the 2% that was called the lost decade of the 80s. Also, the performance of regional economy of 2023 and 24 is analyzed, and the perspectives and prospects for the rest of this year and for 2025. The low growth will persist in 2024 and also in 2025. We show how the present macroeconomic conditions of world economy and the region place obstacles to the capacity of countries to drive growth, that is, to leave the trap of low growth behind. It is pointed out that how the low growth of the last decade has made the per capita GDP of the region to be in the same levels of 10 years back. Almost no growth of per capita GDP. So the survey says that this growth is a key task. It needs to be more inclusive, creating more employment and good quality employment, and also more sustainably environmentally. This is one of the fundamental transformations that should be set as a target by different countries, and with major emphasis in productive development policies as an instrument in order to achieve all this. But in addition to productive development possibilities of driving growth, we see the macroeconomic scenario and conditions have a great influence internally and externally, which is explained in the report. It is characterized by a limited space in the area of fiscal and monetary policies, low growth of world economy, of trade, and also high levels of uncertainty. In the second part, made up of 3 chapters, the survey says how the trap of low growth has impacted the employment dynamics in general terms and also in sectoral terms. Also, how climate change will negatively affect the creation of employment in the region. Chapter 2 focuses in the relationship between growth and employment dynamics, particularly sectoral dimension, and to see what employment and of what quality. There are 2 main findings in that topic. First, it's not a new point, but it is confirmed with new data. There is a close relationship between economic growth and the creation of employment. Specifically, the low growth trap of the last decade has led to a great reduction in the capacity of creating jobs and particularly formal employment. In 2014 to 2020, the average growth of employment in the region was only 1.3%, significantly less than the 3.9 of the decade of the 70s, 3.2 in the 80s, and 2.4 in the decades of the 90s and the year 2000. This decade has been the one of lowest employment growth in 50 years. So the second result is not only employment has gone down, but rather the employment has been in sectors reducing productivity. This is important because there is a perverse structural change in employment towards sectors of less productivity instead of being virtuous to greater productivity. The structural change has been enormous from the 50s to 2020, that is, a service sector went from 28.5 in 1950 to 64.7 in 2020. That is to have 2/3 of total employment. Today, 7 out of 10 work in the service sector.
And this is a major
muy alta proporción de ese empleo en el sector servicios son empleos informales de baja productividad. Por su parte, el sector agrícola pasó de tener más de 50% del empleo en 1950 a menos de 15% hoy día.
15%, less than 15%, and this represents the low growth of employment in the region that in 2024 was at a lower level than in 1980. And for that reason, we argue that one of the major transformations required by the region is not only to generate more employment, but to create that in sectors with greater productivity. And again, that leads us to productive transformation policies. Chapter 3 focuses on the evolution and determinants of informal jobs in the region over the past 10 years. And the main finding, or empirical confirmation, is that most of the jobs created in countries in the region are of an informal nature. And thus, more than 50% of people employed in the region are employed in informal jobs, and this is a figure that has not been reduced, but rather has increased over the past decades. And this is the result of the close relationship between informality and growth. In low growth periods, informal jobs tend to increase. The basic data is that between 2013 and 2022, total employment increased by 10%, but that is 10% is broken down into 18.6% growth in informal employment and only 3.3 in terms of formal employment. In other words, informal employment has increased sixfold or 6 times more than formal employment since 2013, precisely during the low growth trap. Likewise, the sectorial pattern of total employment, labor or job informality is focused on sectors with lower productivity growth, which encompasses 74% of those employed informally. And when we break down this per gender, we find that informal employment among women has grown by 22.8% compared to a growth of 15.7% among men, which shows a gender bias in terms of informal jobs. The chapter also shows that if you're a woman, that increases your probability of being employed in informal jobs. And if you're a woman that have dependents in your household, that probability increases even more. And therefore, policies that promote care policies are fundamental because they can not only increase jobs and increase productivity, but also, and what is most important, can facilitate the access of women to the formal labor market. And likewise, the possibility of being informal or being formal jobs increases with education, both vocational training and higher education. And we also analyze the impact of climate change upon employment. Our region is very vulnerable to climate change, either because it's located in extreme climatic areas or because it relies on aspects such as agriculture, tourism, and so on that are impacted directly by climate change. The simulations presented shows that in a scenario without mitigation of climate change effects, without these policies, in 2050, the GDP level would be 2.5% lower than in the base scenario without climatic shocks. And that leads to the urgent need to have policies and investments in mitigation and adaptation. So out of the result of these 3 chapters in the second part, we can see that the low growth trap that economies in the region find themselves in has led to a reduction in the capability to create jobs, especially formal jobs, and that groups such as young people, women, the elderly, people with low educational levels, and migrants and people that live in rural areas are much more liable to become informal workers. In addition, an intensification of the effects of climate change, if we don't adopt mitigation and adaptation policies, will lead to an important reduction in the number of jobs generated in the mid-term. As we explained during the presentation, in order to tackle these challenges and to boost labor markets, the region must articulate a combination of productive development policies, employment policies, and also macroeconomic measures, together with effective measures aimed at adaptation to climate change and mitigation of its effects. And that requires a significant increase of public and private investment, as well as structural reforms. There is a third part of the study that refers to country notes that analyzes the performance of individual countries in the region in 2023 and during the first half of 2024, together with their respective statistical annexes. And that is available in the ECLAC website. It is not included in the printed report that we are distributing. Those are the main messages. And now it's a pleasure to offer the floor to Daniel to deliver a more detailed presentation with figures and graphs.
Muchas gracias, Secretario Ejecutivo.
Thank you, Executive Secretary. In order to begin the presentation, I am waiting for the mouse so that I can control the PowerPoint presentation. Oh, there it is. Okay. Thank you very much. And as mentioned by the Executive Secretary, the idea of this presentation is to show you the figures that back up the messages that have already been conveyed by the Executive Secretary in his introduction to this survey. And as mentioned, the study has two major modules. One that seeks to look at the macroeconomic situation of the region, the low growth trap within this context, but also with a more structural outlook of involving what is happening in terms of growth in the region, and also discusses macroeconomic conditions in order to determine how to boost growth. And a second part tries to link this dynamic of the low growth trap with the dynamic within labor markets, and the results are the ones that were already mentioned by the Executive Secretary that are of concern. And perhaps the main message is that we have to grow more in order to create more jobs, but it's not enough to create more jobs. We must create jobs in the most productive sectors, which is fundamental in order to change the dynamics of development in the region. And so, without further ado, I'll begin with the presentation that begins with the description of the main macroeconomic variables. It analyzes the global context and the space that our countries have at a domestic level for macroeconomic policies, and after that, the dynamics of the low growth trap. This dynamic was already mentioned by the Executive Secretary. The situation of growth in our region has been very poor. We have a trend, a downward trend. There has been periods of greater growth as a result of commodity prices and so on. But the key message is that the region, as has already been mentioned, if one looks at the 2015, 2024 decade, we have been growing at a very small growth level that has been dropping, and we need to change that dynamic. If we don't change that dynamic, there is little scope to do other things, because despite the fact that growth is a necessary condition, but sometimes not sufficient, it is fundamental for the region to overcome this low growth trap so that it can again boost growth. What are the factors that are of concern? Well, the low growth trap, and again there is a causality that is simultaneous, has been accompanied, and this forms part of the explanation of low investment dynamics. The red line is, you can see that with the red line, this is a region that invests most in terms of the percentage of the GDP, 19.5% compared to 22, 32 or 38% in other latitudes. And therefore, this low growth already states or highlights the fact that we need to boost investment in order to overcome this trap. But at the same time, as was mentioned by the Executive Secretary, the dynamic of low growth and also the dynamic of low investments has had an impact upon the dynamics of the growth of jobs in the region. And the rate of growth in terms of the creation of employment have dropped significantly. And between 2014 and 2023, we evidenced the lowest rates of the past 20 years. And therefore, that implies a major challenge in the sense that low growth and low investments has a repercussion upon a low rate of employment creation, and also of the creation of low quality employment when one looks at this in terms of productivity and other social variables. And this is also accompanied by a very poor performance of labor productivity. As you can see, it increased between 1990 and 2023, in other words, over the past 23 years at a rate of 0.5%. As a yearly average. But if you look at the last decade between 2015 and 2024, we have a negative average growth of productivity, and therefore the decreasing trend of GDP productivity and employment creation has become accentuated over the past decades, and that is of great concern because we have a downward trend that has become accentuated, and that is one of the main messages of the low growth trap and the challenge to overcome that. And on the right-hand side in that graph, you can see that regrettably the dynamic nature of exports has become weaker in order to boost growth. Remember that Latin America adopted what many have called the export-led growth, where exports were called upon to play an important role in terms of total aggregate demand and in terms of the dynamic of growth. And as you can see, between 1995 and 2004, exports grew at an average of close to 7% 2% between 2005 and 2014, close to 5%, and in the last decade between 2015 and 2024, close to 2.8%, which evidences a weakening of the dynamics of exports and the capability to boost growth. And this exerts pressure upon domestic policies and more to do with domestic markets and the issue of productive development policies that were already mentioned by the Executive Secretary. Now, this is simply to show you the major structural challenges and the cyclical challenges that the region has, to the extent that during the last decade these trends have been have had a strong downward trend, and that implies a challenge. Now, this challenge, viewed as from now and towards the future, is in an international context of increasing uncertainty, where on the one hand, world growth for this year is expected at a rate of around 3.2%, is below the average between 2000 and 2019 of 3.8%, and therefore we're experiencing a global scenario that again does not help the region to face up to this low growth trap, to the extent that economic growth is weak. World trade is also quite weak, and world trade again is no longer a force to boost growth as was expected during the globalization. That was part of the arguments for the opening up of our economies, which continues to be valid, but it is not boosting it. And the world growth this year is expected to be of around 2.6% growth, which is well below the 5.8% between 82 and 2007. That then became 2.7 following the subprime crisis, and that never recovered, and therefore world trade again is not promoting growth. And if on top of this we add geopolitical tensions present in the world today, the perception of global uncertainty and the effects of the global economy in terms of supporting our countries to overcome the low growth trap are not adequate together. We're in a discussion, given the fact that during the last, as a result of the last events, the world economy is going through a soft landing, as it is called. Latest data from the US debating how soft this landing will be, and we are unclear on whether these dynamics may or may not actually occur. Investment rates and financial markets continue to involve high financial costs, and despite the fact that countries in the region evidence a reduction in terms of their sovereign risk, this involves high financial costs in the region, given the fact that central banks of the main economies, as you can see in the graph, still maintain high interest rates. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the rate of sovereign bonds in a 10-year period that shows the cost of financing in the future, and the region faces high financing costs in a financial market with increasing uncertainty about the future. And another issue that we feel is important is that if you analyze the graph on the left-hand side that shows financial revenues in the balance of payments, the main source that's contributed to this is foreign direct investment and the portfolio movements and other investments that shows the purchase of shares, credits, and so on have been negative. In other words, net resources are exiting the region, as is occurring in most developing economies as a result of financial uncertainties and other issues that mean that when it comes to the exit and income and the reception of revenues, we have had negative figures, and foreign direct investment have had an impact upon financial accounts in the balance of payments. And we also want to highlight the importance of the repatriation of funds, and in many countries in the region this is a very strong source of financing, and you can see there that in the case of Nicaragua or Guatemala or El Salvador and Honduras, this represent practically 26% of the GDP between 20 and 26% of the GDP, and thus a very important financing source that is related to the dynamics of what happens in the US economy and in the Spanish economy primarily, which is where the repatriation of funds are received.
In this uncertain context of growth of the global economy, the space of macroeconomic policies for the region continues to be restricted. As you can see here, the primary deficit last year, and for this year we expect one minus 0.4%, whilst we expect growth in the global deficit of 3.132 that reflects the payment of debt interest payments. And one of the issues that limits the fiscal space of Latin America and the Caribbean is the high indebtedness level of countries today that in a context of high financial context is a restriction to spending possibility of our countries. We need to be working on that because there's a high demand for fiscal expenditure to combat climate change and also productive development policies. So there is an issue there. How much the debt restricts the challenge and demand of our countries to generate fiscal expenditure to support growth, combat climate change, and support the productive development policy. The Caribbean also has a restricted fiscal situation, although in the Caribbean last year, in 2023, it had a fiscal surplus of 1.4, and it is expected also here a surplus of 0.5% for this year. But if you see the global deficit increased from 1.6 to 2.6, and that reflects the payment of interest payments. Therefore, the effort of savings in the Caribbean goes to paying the debt that is kept quite high, 67, 68% in the first semester of this year. Those are very high debt levels. How this graph, and I would ask you, in this graph, what you can see is the dynamics of tax income, tax earnings in average for the countries of the region. And they are around 15. No, he corrects himself. This is the current expenditure. It is in average between 15.7 and 15.6% of GDP. But if you see the graph on the right that we want to emphasize, the blue line is the interest payment. And starting 2014, it has an upward trend. And the orange line is public investment. Beginning the same year starts to drop and a downward trend. And the gap, the effort made by the region for the service of the debt and not for public investment. That is a major challenge if we want to change the development model, break away from the growth trap and promote the labor market. Most of the expenses and financial resources go to serve the debt. So the region will have difficulties to break that trap of low growth. That is one of our main challenges. A subject that we raise now in this study and in others is evasion and elusion exacerbate the insufficiency of tax earnings in the region. And as you can see, the tax income has been 16% of GDP. However, evasion and elusion are strong in the region. We've estimated in average, it is equivalent to 6.7% of the regional GDP, $433 billion. Here we have an evasion on income tax and added value tax and evasion 4.6% of GDP. And added value tax, it's an evasion of 2.1% of GDP, and income is 4.6% of GDP. There are strong, and the idea is to drive and leverage productive development to expand the fiscal space. The region should be making an effort to reduce this elusion and evasion in order to strengthen fiscal policies in the region. Now, moving on to inflation and monetary policies. The countries in the region in general reducing interest rates. That is a positive movement, given the reduction in the inflationary dynamics of the world. What we are seeing is that still they are high, just like in the world. In the case of Brazil, it reached a maximum of of 13.75. The monetary policy rate is in 50 today, but the minimum rate between 2021 and 22 of 2% continues to be high. In Colombia, same thing, from 13 to 11, but continues to be very high interest rates. And you see, I will not go country by country, but in general, the interest rates today, although they have gone down, Chile is one that brought it from 11.25 to 5.75. They continue to be quite high as compared to 2021. And the effort of banks need to be centered to expand monetary policy. This position of interest rates being still high has translated into a slowdown of domestic credit, and to the extent that there is less internal domestic credit, the internal band is lower. Therefore, the monetary policy needs to be expanded there. And of course, it's not that central banks did not decide to bring down the rates just because they want to. This is limited by the international financial market, what is happening with the monetary policy of the United States, affecting rates in the world, also by the dynamics of the inflation, and strengthening the dollar, generating pressures on the economy. It hasn't been easy to generate space for monetary policy. Therefore, the space for the macro policy, fiscal and monetary, is restricted in this juncture for the region. So it's not easy to support and generate all the impetus needed in the cycle in order to make the growth more dynamic. In this context, global uncertainty and low space for macroeconomic policy in the region is that we have updated our forecasts. And for 2024, a growth of 1.8% is forecasted for Latin America and the Caribbean. There are countries that grow significantly. Dominican Republic, 5.2. Venezuela will have a leap of growth this year, Costa Rica around 4, but there are only 2 countries in the region that will have a contraction this year. Haiti with a drop of 3.0 and Argentina of 3.0. Latin America and the Caribbean 1.8, Central America and Mexico 3.1%. On the Caribbean side, we are expecting a growth of 2.6% if Guyana is excluded, and 8.4% if Guyana is included, because there it is expected to grow 29% because of the discovery of oil reserves. But it is a special shock, and we would be expecting an average growth for the Caribbean of 2.6% this year. And there you have the list of all the countries. For 2024, it is expected a growth of 1.8%. Now, for 2025, there will be a very mild increase in the growth rate, but this is going to continue to be low in 2.3%. There will be greater economic dynamism next year, but still at rates that are very low. And so we need to be capable of making it more dynamic. For Central America, 3.1, South America, 2.4. Those are the expectations. And Haiti would be the only country with a contraction next year. I'm not going to the details of figures because of time. And on the Caribbean, there will be a slight slowdown of the growth next year as compared to this one. And the growth rate will be 2.3%. So the region, although it grows at 1.8 and next year will be a bit more dynamic, it still is in a low growth plateau. And that is the challenge of how to break the trap of low growth. And in the macroeconomic context of this year and next are not that favorable in order to make growth more dynamic in the region. The second part, as the Executive Secretary mentioned, it is the low growth trap and the dynamics of employment. What is sought here? How these 30 years of slowdown, deceleration, have affected the dynamics of the labor market. Chapter 1 has the main results. A rate of creation of employment has gone down. The greater dynamics of employment is in sectors of lower productivity, and the region shows a poor performance of the quality. And this here we see how service sector has been the source of greater demand for employment. Agriculture from 2010 to today have 0.1 and minus 0.2%. The industry went from 2.1 and today it is in a rate of 0.4. And the service sector has decelerated, has slowed down, and has a greater demand for occupation, has a rate of 1.7 between until 2019 and 1.2 is, and this is today. This dynamics has translated, as mentioned, into a change of the participation of the service sector in the total of employment. It is around 64.7, 65% versus 29 it had before. Industry has been stable and agriculture has dropped from 49 to 14% today. This is an important graph to highlight. Unfortunately, on the left side of your screen, you have the sectors of lower productivity growth, would be construction, mining, services. And on the right side, you see where is total employment. And if you realize 78% of total employment is in the lower productivity sectors of the economy. That is a very important and relevant data when you are considering not only the creation of employment, but the quality of employment with productivity, higher productivity and coverage, social protection coverage. And that is the challenge of productive development and employment in the region that has to do not only with creating more employment, but achieving a transition of creating employment, but in the higher productivity sectors. And that is what the executive secretary called regressive structural change. It's not strange to see that the dynamics of productivity today, we are below 1980. Productivity was 94%, and the index is below the productivity of the 80s. And this sectoral dynamics, where is employment heading to or concentrating on? If you see on the graph of the right, we show that there are two ways of measuring change in productivity. Once it's called intra-sectoral effect, how it grows within the sector proper, and how productivity grows due to changes in sectors, that is from a lower to higher productivity. In Latin America, 94%, between 94 and 97% of change in productivity is explained for what happens in the interior of the sector. And to the extent that employment is channeled to lower productivity sectors, we will have this behavior of productivity. So to mobilize to higher productivity sectors is one of the greatest challenges of the labor market today. Second chapter of this study examines the determinant factors of informal work in Latin America and the Caribbean. One, the growth of occupational work is explained by the increase of informal jobs. Informality is concentrated in sectors of lower productivity, just like total employment. A lower economic growth generates more informality, and education levels reduce the probability of being informal, whilst the condition of being a woman, gender, and living in homes with dependents increases the probability of being informal. Very briefly, I'll show you a few numbers. Of the total growth of employment between 2013 and 2022, it grew 10%. 18% of that was in the informal sector, only 3.3% in the formal one. As considered by gender, men 7.8, 1.3 in the informal, women 13.3% in total growth, and 22 is in the informal sector, and only 6% in the formal sector. That was for women. For total employment, 74% is concentrated in sectors of lower productivity. But it's also concerning that in 2013, it was only 70%. So the participation of informality has grown in sectors of lower productivity, and that is also very important.
As mentioned by the Executive Secretary, there is a close relationship between growth and informality. Here you can see that between 2004 and 2008, the variation of the product was around 5%, and informal jobs grew by 4.2% and informal only by 0.4%. If you look at the 2015 to 2022 period, the average rate of growth was 0.9%, informal growth was 2% on average, whilst formal jobs increased only 1.4%. And on the right-hand side, the results of a model that we ran, we show the probability, which is the green lines, comparing 2016 to 2020, 2013, which is the base year. There is an increase in the probability of being informal, likewise in 2019 and likewise in 2022, given the slowdown of the growth that we have experienced during these years. Here, I would just like to highlight a result that I think is very relevant. First of all, that education significantly reduces the probability of becoming informal, 27.3 in terms of complete technical education, and practically 33% when it comes to complete university education. And what is important is that not only reduces the probability of being informal, but vocational and university education will play a key role in terms of paving the way towards the transition of workers from low productivity jobs to high productivity jobs that require greater technical or vocational and higher education training. As mentioned, and this is why I move on very quickly with these slides, the condition of being a woman increases the probability of being informal, and it also increases far more when you have women with dependents and when you compare that with men with dependents, and therefore there is a gender bias that we do need to tackle in the labor markets. And to close this issue of Chapter 2, it's important to show that informality is concentrated on two age groups, on the youngest and on the elderly. In other words, people tend to enter the labor market as informal workers. They become formal, and once they become old persons, so they go back into informality, and that partly explains the life cycle of many households. And finally, the condition of migrants, again, increases the probability of being informal if one is a migrant, and likewise the condition of whether one lives in a rural versus urban region. That also increases the condition of becoming an informal worker. And to close this, I would like to value the third chapter that tries to evaluate the impact of climate change upon job creation. And for that purpose, we ran an exercise that ECLAC has been working on, as mentioned by the Executive Secretary, in terms of the impact on growth if climate shocks become much more acute. I am not going to talk about the details of the model, but between 2023 and 2050, the bottom line reflects an intensification of climate shocks, and the level of GDPs leads to the level of GDP practically 12.3% less by 2050. And when that establishes the relationship between growth and employment via the and takes that to the labor market, one can estimate that there will be a significant loss of jobs. And now this is a scenario where we have not conducted adaptation and mitigation policies, and therefore the major message is that in order to prevent this, we must conduct a mitigation and adaptation policies, and the impact upon jobs will be a loss of practically 43 million jobs, equivalent to around 10% of the labor force. If these climate shocks become much more acute and one does nothing in order to compensate or prevent that more acute nature of climate shocks, and this would lead to a significant drop in GDPs and also a significant impact of practically, in terms of job reduction, representing more than practically 43 million jobs. And that is the end of the report. And again, I would like to offer the floor to the Executive Secretary. Thank you, Daniel. And in order to conclude this part on recommendations, so we go back to this issue of that implies that in order to challenge the low growth trap, to increase employment and create more productive jobs, we require a strengthening of productive development policies with an adequate economic context. But what is key is these productive development policies in order to have a structural change. We have not experienced a structural change that adequately positions more people in higher productivity jobs and therefore with higher salaries and in general that promote the revenues per capita of the economies and living conditions. Another way of saying this is that, and these are the two sides of the same coin, the issue of jobs and productive development. We cannot create a better labor future without creating a better future for production. Now, how do we create a better future for production? Well, this is a summary. This is not something simple, but nobody said that development is simple, and that is why we are as we are. And therefore, there are a whole series of pillars, as you can see, that form part of what is included in the productive development policies. It includes working in science, technology, and innovation, technological outreach, especially for SMEs that require that, the digital transformation, entrepreneurial ecosystems for entrepreneurship and startups, the closure of human capital gaps, financing, of course, and so on and so forth. In public investment in infrastructure, but not only in general infrastructure, but in specific infrastructure for sectors that can boost growth with a territorial approach. And that is the type of comprehensive approach of new generation productive development policies that we are promoting as from ECLAC. And in order to overcome the low growth trap, this becomes absolutely essential. A component of these productive development policies is not to be shy when it comes to betting on different specific sectors. It is important, and now more than ever, as a result of technological change and as a result of the issue of sustainability, you can see the sectors that the world is working on, but we have to be explicit on this and improve this energy transition, electromobility, circular economy, bioeconomy for food security, sustainable tourism, sustainable management of water, and also the export of modern services, the issue of the society of care that we already mentioned, and that has tremendous potential, not only in terms of creating jobs for those that work in care networks, but also enables the policy by having care networks of having far greater participation of women in the labor market and, of course, industrial sectors and more traditional industrial sectors. This forms part of the solution for the type of problems that we diagnosed and that we have discussed, both in terms of employment with the issue of informality, but also for the growth rate to make it much more inclusive and sustainable. And as a major conclusion, then, these productive development policies in themselves can make a tremendous contribution, but they require a macroeconomic framework and also efforts in terms of adaptation and mitigation to climate change. In terms of macroeconomic policies, to expand and strengthen the spaces for macroeconomic policies, both fiscal and monetary, as explained very well by Daniel. In fiscal terms, to move towards more progressive taxation structures to reduce tax evasion and to improve the quality of the allocation of expenditure. In terms of the monetary aspect, to the use of supplementary instruments, policy instruments, including monetary and macro-prudential. In terms of employment, as seen in the previous graph, the structural change towards sectors of greater productivity, and to have sectorial policies is a strong way of doing that is with cluster initiatives. And in terms of climate action policies, of course, we require a tremendous leap in investments, and there is an important challenge there when it comes to financing. Mitigation means to favor the energy transition and also the use of timely financing. There is a major discussion on how to mobilize financing, not only for mitigation and adaptation, but also for sustainable development goals. Those are the main recommendations of this report. Thank you very much. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Now we offer the floor, or we move on to the Q&A section presented by the media. And there are colleagues from the media that accompany us today face to face. And we will express a couple of questions that were sent to us. And after that, we'll offer the floor to those members of the media that are in the room. We have received, Executive Secretary, a question Thomson Reuters, Fabian Andrés Candelo, the following questions. In the report, you refer to the fact that the situation could be aggravated as a result of the worsening of climate change effects. So what type of factors are you referring to, and how intensive have these effects become lately? and also asks that in other surveys you have referred to the low growth trap. How feasible do you feel that countries in the region will indeed be able to overcome these barriers? Executive Secretary. Thank you very much, Fabian Andrés Cambero, for that question. In the region, the impacts are very evident, and we experience them every day, every month in all countries, regrettably. We have seen heat waves, droughts, floods, and so on. Some as a result of the lack of water, others as a result of an excess of water, and for other reasons. Of course, a greater proportion of the territory in Central America, for example, has experienced extreme droughts for at least a month, and in some cases for more than 6 months. In Chile, the mega drought that impacts this country for 14 years now continued in 2022, and that becomes the most severe and long-lasting drought that has been registered in the region in more than 1,000 years, as far as I understand it. In addition, countries in Central America and the Caribbean have increased the frequency of intensive hurricanes and storms over the past decade. And of course, there are figures, more precise figures, and we have also measured the impacts of these climate shocks that already, as a result of the increase of climate warming, implies that this will become much more intense in the future, and that implies damage in coasts, the displacement of agricultural activities, issues related to coastal tourism that impacts the Caribbean and other countries and so on. There are a whole series of very concrete impacts upon people, upon productive activities, and in consequence, there is a need to invest in order to compensate and prevent that. And that is why this chapter that we have included in this survey is absolutely fundamental. Because if we're on top of all our problems related to low growth traps and a slowdown in the world economy, we now face a new phenomenon of global warming that also implies obstacles. But there are also major opportunities, because those sectors that I mentioned in the past comply with different objectives. They help us to mitigate, but they help us to create jobs, investments, and to generate growth. And those major transformations in electromobility, the major transformation towards the energy transition, towards a more sustainable tourism, towards more sustainable agricultural activities, a responsible management of water, in general helps not only to save those resources, but also to create jobs and investments.
Pregunta es que nos hemos referido en otros informes a la trampa.
The other question has to do with the low growth trap. How feasible do we feel that countries will be able to overcome that? Well, there is a solution at the end of the presentation. I shared with you the generation of the new generation productive development policies, and therefore we have to discuss seriously the issue of productive development policies. We must escalate them, increase our level of ambition, and bet upon strategic sectors, and all this related, as mentioned, with science and technology policies, entrepreneurial systems, financing, an adequate climate or environment for investments and financing. And another way of saying this is that there are several countries, I wouldn't say many, but there is a good number of countries that have introduced major transformation in 30 or 40 years. The main message here, without dwelling on details, is that we have to create a culture of growth, a culture of productive transformation, a national wide-ranging consensus, in the sense that the country establishes goals for itself and works in order to achieve those goals. To the extent that countries are distracted with many other things, that productive development, that structural transformation will not happen spontaneously. This is something that has to be planned, and we have to manage that transformation, and that involves political commitments. It also requires institutional commitments in terms of capabilities and also governance issues. Executive Secretary, before we move on to another question.
Another question in email or in Zoom. Valentina Bastillas from the Xinhua News Agency. How the natural disasters, ever more frequent and intense, may affect the growth and development dynamics of Latin American countries. What should countries do in order to overcome emergency situations with direct impact on people and lead to millionaire losses in infrastructure, among others? Director Daniel Tittelman, thank you for the question. To Valentina Bastillas from Xinhua News Agency. This is along the same lines what the Executive Secretary had said. Latin America and the Caribbean are very vulnerable to climate change shocks, and there are two shocks. The immediate ones, which are the hurricanes, and main rainfall and floods that generate a loss of physical capital, productivity, and the slower ones, which are droughts and generate changes and are expressed in time in a slower time. Therefore, the countries of the region, as the Executive Secretary had said, are subject to both types of shocks and thus generating a loss in the productive capacity of countries, in the fiscal capacity of countries, because there is a limit in the collection capacity and a tremendous challenge for expenditure. You need to reinvest, restore the bridge that was full. It's like a snowball, an investment that is destroyed by these shocks, hurricanes, and this type of change. And then you come the drought shocks that affect the productivity of the economy, generating low growth. And ECLAC has worked on these subjects, and there is 12% of loss in the dynamic of growth from here to 2050 if demands are not all completed. The second part, what to do? Well, a major investment effort for mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is related on how to solve the problems when productive capacity of countries is destroyed, agriculture and bridges, but then adaptation is how to change the productive infrastructure in order to reduce global and coexist with global temperature, and that is linked to productive development tools and generated structural changes in the production structure of countries involving changes in the energy matrix or sectoral focus in dynamic sectors that will be environmentally sustainable. Thank you, Daniel Tittelman, Director of Development of ECLAC. Yes, colleague, please, go ahead. Your name and the media. María José Errázuriz, Diario desde Spain. To Mr. Salazar, in your presentation, you addressed topics that are not of the report proper. And you see low social mobility, cohesion, and governance weakness. How much do these factors weigh in these drafts? Or you really think that do not influence, do not have an influence on the report you are delivering? Yes, thank you very much for the question. I mention every time I can, although the report is no focus on those subjects, I always mention those topics. So there are three main traps. Low growth, a key subject for today because of the nature of this survey, but also the well-known trap is not necessarily well known, not well understood, which is the high inequality, low social mobility, and weak social condition. We are emphasizing those three topics. We have produced documents on that, and in fact, that is going to be one of the key points, key subjects in the special session in Lima, Peru. And we have a document going deeper into each one of these traps, quite balanced. There are long chapters on each one of them. And also on the hows. We have insisted not only what to do, but how to do it in order to leave those traps behind. That doesn't mean that we have the solution in ECLAC. We have good ideas. We have good recommendations. But the hows is to say that countries need to have a conversation about the quality of governance, the quality of top capacities of institutions, technical, operational, political, perspective, capacities to think about the future, space for dialogue in order to develop, and that is part of capacities of a country, because in those dialogue spaces you can generate major agreements, major outlooks, and therefore have a willingness from key actors in order to promote transformations. So that is more or less the narrative that we believe that it is correct, it is the way to think in development, not only on a technocratic approach, which is important, of course, the diagnosis, accurate diagnosis, data, public policies, which are evidence-based, but we need to think very well in the political part of transformations. Political, I mean in the good meaning, how a society is organized in order to collectively move forward and progress. Did I answer? Yes, it's a fact that the weakness of institutions and governance has gone increscendo these years. Has the process been accelerated? I don't know if your question is if the deterioration of governance has been accelerated. Yes, and thus all the traps. Well, because of that, the subject of governance and this third trap is cross-sectional. It is mainstreaming, where we have a report identifying the 10 major gaps in Latin America and the Caribbean. And in order to move along those gaps and close them, the subject of governance and good capacity is key. It's difficult to generalize, like saying, are we going back in governance? It depends. The reality of countries is diverse. There are good policies, good practices. There are areas in where Latin America has moved forward. Brazil, for example, has had Bolsa Familia, Hunger Zero, and others where they have provided lessons for the rest of the world and Latin America. Costa Rica and other countries also have made progress in environment, sustainability, sustainable tourism, also the Caribbean. And so we can continue naming and pointing to success cases in productive subjects, social transport policies, health, education. Yes, but I would say also there are major areas of deterioration. Two things. One, where not sufficient progress has been made in the institutional capacities, and in others that they did, but then some institutions deteriorated, downgraded. And so this is a main area of work of ECLAC. That is why. Thank you, Executive Secretary. In the room, is there any other question? If not, we go to the question of Silvia Rodriguez from Forbes. The economy in the United States shows signals of deceleration, slowdown. How serious will this be for Mexico? And what will be the major effects be? And Mexico has the commitment of doing fiscal consolidation next year. Of what magnitude could the economic impact of this policy is? Silvia Rodriguez from Forbes. Thank you, Silvia Rodriguez, for those questions. Yes, in fact, there are clear signals and signs of a slowdown of the economy of Latin America, and this will impact Mexico, Central America, and all the countries where the U.S. is a major trade partner. For 2024, our estimate is that the economic activity of Mexico will increase 1.9%. That will be the growth rate in the real terms as compared to 3.2 of last year. This mainly due to the economic slowdown of the United States, a major trade partner for Mexico, but also a slowdown of consumption and investment in Mexico. the effects of that slowdown in the U.S. on the U.S. economy have been perceived in 2024 and for this year and next year as well. In 2025, in ECLAC, we estimate that the GDP of Mexico will grow at 1.4, slightly below 1.9 of this year. And this, once again, as a result of that United States deceleration and also uncertainty of the international arena, and also due to a reduction in public spending. Of course, there are factors that can modify the estimate upwards or downwards. These estimates are based on certain assumptions, but these are the data that we are providing. Now, as to the fact that Mexico has a commitment for fiscal consolidation and what's the impact? Well, in accordance with the Finance and Public Credit Secretariat, the fiscal deficit of the non-financial fiscal sector will be 5% of GDP, and the financial requirements of public sector, 5.9% of GDP. This is the greatest deficit since 1990 and ascribed to the financing of public works, emblematic ones of the government, a great investment effort. In March of 24, the Secretariat of Public Credit and Finance presented before Congress an economic outlook where modifications were not included. However, a reduction of the budget deficit was projected of 2.5% of GDP for 2025. And as I said, the growth estimate for 2025 is 1.4, already incorporating that reduction of public spending, which is one of the causal factors for that slight growth reduction in that year. And then Yolanda Morales, a reporter of The Economist of Mexico. She is the Mexican restrictive policy, a pressure factor downwards. What is the role of nearshoring for the Mexican economic activity? Is it a driver that could counteract the down pressures and economic expectations? Does it contemplate the impact of the slowdown of the U.S.? Finally, as I've said, yes, it does contemplate the deceleration of the United States. As to the restrictive policy subject, we need to distinguish between monetary policy and fiscal policy. The fiscal policy in Mexico in 23 and 24, as I have explained, was expansive. Series of major important projects plus a series of transfers, very significant in pensions and others. And that led to an increase in social spending and investment in public infrastructure. That on the fiscal side. As to the monetary policy, the target rate of the Bank of Mexico has been high, and the negative effect on the purchasing power of Mexican families also, in order to control that negative effect of inflation. In 2024, consumption and investment are feeling somewhat negatively that high level of interest rates. However, as you know, the monetary policy rate or reference rate of the Mexican bank has had reductions in 2024. In the 23, that reference rate was 11.25, which is at the maximum historical level since the adoption of the inflation goals methods as a monetary instrument in March 24 of this year. Because of the moderation of the increase of prices, the Bank of Mexico reduced the interest interbank rate of 25 basis points. So went down from 11.25 to 11. And in August, it has just gone down also to another 25 points. So it is in 10.75 right now. So the fiscal policy has been expansive, the monetary policy more restrictive, because with two modifications. What's the nearshoring role? Well, no doubt. that Mexico is one of the countries best off in order to benefit from the nearshoring trends. It is right beside the United States. It is integrated together with a series of industries and sectors. It has free trade agreement with the US and Canada, and also has important value chains, automotive, aerospace, medical devices, and highly integrated ones. So if you have a critical mass, it's easier to grow based on that. So that's part of a major position. It's difficult to see that in statistics, as we saw in certain details when we presented the report on direct foreign investment.
But what is clear is that everything related to the increase of investments in manufacturing, well, there is 50% of total revenues from foreign direct investment in Mexico in 2023, resulting from issues from aspects related to manufacturing. And one could think that to a large extent are the flows of relocation. That is still a little difficult. We would still have to determine what is it's strictly international relocation or investments that would have gone to China or Asia and that are now being received by Mexico as a result of this new international geopolitics. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Pedro Schwartz, correspondent of the France Press Agency. He asks, what factors explain a lower regional growth estimations for 2024 compared to what was presented last year by ECLAC, where it estimated 2.1% growth? Daniel Titelman. Thank you, Pedro, for that question. Well, the factors behind a reduction in growth estimates have been mentioned during the presentation and by the Executive Secretary. On the one hand, the greater uncertainty in the global economics, both in terms of its growth dynamics, financial uncertainties. Last week, we saw a significant drop in the stock exchange that led to a discussion about whether the US is moving towards a soft landing or whether there could be a larger drop. So there is greater uncertainty in the global economy. That means that financial conditions are much more complex for our countries. And there is a change in the direction of many of the financing flows. On the other, we also mentioned a lower space for fiscal policies. Countries in the region still have inflation rates over and above the goals of the central bank. That has limited the strengthening of the dollar. And what is happening in the global economy, that has limited the downward adjustment of interest rates by many central banks. And that has meant that monetary policies are still at a level of what we call a restrictive level, and domestic credits have also dropped. A third factor is that the unemployment rate and the dynamics of the labor markets has remained relatively slow, and unemployment rates are still stable in that sense. And what we are evidencing is that there is a slowdown of growth in the second half of this year. And that is what explains the larger growth expected for next year. And therefore, what I would say is that the lower rate reflects a first half of the year which is less dynamic than what we would have expected at the beginning of the year. A second semester that is becoming much more dynamic compared to the first half of this year, but still not enough in order to compensate this lower growth during the first semester. But that partly explains why in 2025 we are expecting an increase in growth rates of 2.3%. Thank you, Daniel Titelman. Carmen Esquivel, correspondent of Prensa Latina, a press agency. And she asks something that has been discussed, but has an interesting complement, whether you could explain the impact of extreme climate change upon the labor market, and what is the effect of the low growth trap in terms of the accomplishment of Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Carmen Esquivel from Prensa Latina. Thank you, Carmen. Well, in terms of the first question, I believe that we have already talked about that. The effects upon the economy, as we said, are very significant, and we already have some figures. Agriculture, tourism, they rely on how much coast there is and so on. But these are very significant impacts in production, in productivity, in the displacement of people. And that is indeed related to the impact upon employment, because to the extent that there is a displacement of persons, so those people will probably go to cities, will migrate domestically, or will migrate abroad, and that involves a challenge when it comes to absorbing those people in other activities or in other locations. And therefore, that leads to geographic relocation of production to a certain extent, and also of employment. And that has to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis, on a country-by-country basis. But the important conclusion and the point we want to make is that this phenomenon of climate change, and until recently we were discussing whether that was true or not, but we now not only know that that is true, but it is happening at a statistical scale, but it is also something that has an impact upon the economic development, upon people, upon social challenges, upon investment challenges, upon issues related to the repair of damage, and how to mitigate all those effects, because the world is still advancing towards the emission of greenhouse effect gases, and that can worsen the situation in the future. That in order to provide you with a general answer. Now, what is the impact of the low growth trap when it comes to the accomplishment of SDGs by 2030? Well, a way of thinking about this is to think in two ways. We can think that if there is low growth, that is as a result of the fact that investment is low because productivity is low, and that low growth implies that fiscal revenues will be low in this world in which we live, and this was explained by Daniel, where we experience some macroeconomic restrictions, little fiscal space, and if there's little fiscal space, there is little money to invest in public investments and in order to make a social transfers to health, education, and so on. And so a low growth trap is not good news when it comes to mobilizing financial resources, investments, and of making the social transfers that are being required. But we can think about this in a different way, and to say that SDGs require transformations. There are SDGs that require transformation when it comes to water, to caring for the oceans and infrastructure, health, education, also when it comes to decent employment and so on. And one can think, well, what are those transformations? Well, those transformations are important investments. They imply new technologies, new ecosystems, new infrastructure, new training programs. And therefore, if one brings together a whole series of transformations in SDGs, and let us not even focus on the 17 SDGs, but on half of them, truly significant transformations, well, the result will be higher growth. One can think of this in the other way around. If countries introduce these transformations for SDGs, they will grow more, and perhaps that is an even better or more interesting way of thinking about this. And a different way of saying this is to say that countries, let's see, behind a rate of growth of 0.9% for 10 years, underlying that rate of growth, by definition, that implies that there have been no major transformations. Otherwise, the rate of growth would have been higher. So we can think about this in various ways, and in consequence, the issue of the low growth trap is profound, is important, and is related to every single SDG. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Candida Costa, the economics editor of newspaper Listín Diario from the Dominican Republic, asks a whole series of questions, and I believe that Daniel Titelman will answer these questions. Candida Costa says, how countries such as the Dominican Republic can combine solutions to the low growth trap with employment dynamics. So what short-term recommendations do you have? Climate change is a factor, but rich countries and emerging countries are responsible for severe damage to nature. Does ECLAC believe that cooperation should be expanded to less developed agencies, international cooperation? That is what Candida is asking. And She concludes by saying, in Latin America, inequality prevails. How can we change that, at least with quality public education, in order to leave no one behind? Those are the considerations by Candida Costa, Cristín Diario from the Dominican Republic. Daniel Titelman, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Candida, for the questions. With regards to the first question, I would like to remind you that the Dominican Republic is one of the countries that has grown most in the past few years in the region. And for this year, we are expecting a growth of 5.2%, far beyond the average for the region. And in that sense, we need to maintain that growth dynamic. In order to link your question of how that growth can be transformed in the labor market, I would like to bring to the floor the two issues mentioned by the Executive Secretary and that were present in the presentation. Regrettably, the greater creation of employment is in sectors that are less productive, and therefore we must maintain growth to generate more employment and more growth in employment. But a major challenge is how to change so that that greater growth in employment goes to sectors that are more productive, and that requires productive development policies together with labor policies that enable, and also educational policies that enable an improvement of the skills of workers in order to produce productive development policies, betting on sectors that boost growth and that create more employment.
Acomodar políticas por el lado productivo.
We know need greater growth, but also policies that facilitate the transition of workers towards more productive sectors that require more skilled workers, skilled in both technical and educational terms. Now, with regards to climate change, well, climate change is a global phenomenon, and therefore the way to face up to this is via cooperation. Now, as from the perspective of Latin American and Caribbean countries, developing countries in general, facing up to climate change requires a major leap in terms of investments between 5 and 8% of the GDP as an average per year in development. And to be able to finance that investment, that will mean that we have to generate access to financing markets at reasonable costs and far lower than the costs that we face at present. And therefore, international cooperation will be fundamental, not only in terms of helping to mobilize the financial resources that our countries require to finance investment, but also in order to generate the costs that are adequate and that enable the sustainability of indebtedness that will be implicit in that higher level of investment. And therefore, international cooperation is very important, both in technological terms, both in terms of common efforts in order to reduce global warming, and also in order to help countries with access to financing so that they can invest in mitigation and adaptation. And in terms of gaining access to abundant financing and at a reasonable cost, enabling the sustainability of indebtedness to be sustainable over time. And lastly, the importance of education, and especially of public education as a fundamental aspect in order to face up to inequality and generate social mobility. So that is something that the ECLAC has put forward very strongly, and that would be linked to your question. To the extent that vocational and university education help to lower informality and move towards more productive jobs, so well, that will have an important impact upon income distribution. Thank you, Daniel Titelman. We are close to the end of this press conference. Inés Saldaña from El Universal of Mexico asked a couple of questions. The first one has already been mentioned in the answers related to the impact of nearshoring on Mexico, but there is a second question that Yvette has asked and refers to the paradox between the multiple investment announcements in the Mexican economy and a fairly slow or low growth. How to deal with that paradox, Executive Secretary?
Sí, bueno, vamos a ver, todos esos anuncios de
Let's see, all those investment announcements are in general very good news. But we have to take into consideration that that is equivalent to an average of 2% of Mexico's GDP. In other words, Mexico is a very big country, and therefore it would require many more investment announcements in order to make a difference in Mexico. Now, there are specific sectors and areas that have been transformed and that continue to be transformed with those investment announcements and all the investments behind those announcements, rather. So, The growth of an economy, such as the Mexican economy, requires factors that go far beyond foreign direct investment in itself. For a country such as Mexico, well, that will not lead to development. It requires national investment. It requires SMEs, companies, sectors in Mexico, in cities, in rural areas, and so on. That there be also movement in terms of private and public investment, in terms of the strengthening of the labor force, in terms of boosting productivity, and so on.
So that is the answer. It's not that it is a paradox. It's insufficient. You cannot expect direct foreign investment to do the homework of developing a country. There are many other things. You have social policies, the effectiveness of institutions, programs, etc. So that doesn't mean that this is not important. Of course, the nearshoring is fundamental. The great opportunity of Mexico, or one of the main opportunities of Mexico, is to be so close of the US market, to be so integrated, the relocation of geopolitics, geoeconomy. There are many opportunities in this new geopolitics, not only threats, and as particularly for Mexico and Central America. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Juan Eduardo Gasparica from Prensa Libre of Guatemala asks about the growth prospects for Guatemala 2024-25. Is there a change or variation regarding what was said before, and what aspects are new? And Guatemala, does it face a low growth trap? What are the reasons and suggestions to overcome that? Juan Eduardo Gasparico, Director of Economy in Prensa Libre, Guatemala. Thank you for the question. We estimate that the economic Guatemala activity will grow at 3.4% in 2024. It's a slight deceleration as a result of a lower level of remittances, imports and exports, because, yes, Guatemala has the United States as an important trade partner. And in the first 5 months of this year, the exports of commodities registered an interannual drop of 1.8, and the monthly rate of economic activity showed an interannual average growth of 3.6 in the first 5 months, less than the same period last year. For 2025, a 3.2% is expected, given the reduction in world trade. But Guatemala is in a category, as Central America in general, they're all growing at least at 3 or more percent. They are not in the category of 1 or 2 as the rest. Now, projections, forecasts of the growth rate for 2024 have not had any change since our preliminary balance was launched in December of 2023. If this projection changes vis-a-vis the previous one, no, it's quite stable. It is maintained stable. And the last point is, yes, Guatemala also faces the trap. Why? How can this be corrected? Well, yes, but above the average of average growth of the whole region. This is good news, halfway, that is, because it would be good that that growth be higher. But here, when we see the specific case of a country, not only discuss the growth rates, that major average, but see what are the sectors, dynamic sectors. And if those are dynamic sectors, what type of employment do they generate? How to have a broader basis for growth, with greater economic democracy, greater participation, a broad grassroots and basis that would improve the living standard, quality of life, major employment for largest sectors of the population. So it's good news that Guatemala is growing at 3.6% and not less. But once again, the content and the features of the productive structure of employment in Guatemala, in order to draw better conclusions not only about the trap, but the nature of the situation in which Guatemala is. I mean, you need to move to sophisticated and make it even thinner the whole analysis. And we are collaborating with Guatemala in several ways. I had the chance of meeting President Arevalo and ministers in March. And our office in Mexico is in constant contact. There is a work plan by ECLAC and other UN agencies and development banks. Thank you very much, Executive Secretary Maria Martinez Moore of EFE, a Spanish news agency. How can the situation of Venezuela affect the economic growth of the region, given that many experts forecast a new migration wave in view of the lack of resolution of the political crisis lived there? Daniel Titelman. Well, thank you, Maria, for the question. As you can see in the report this year, we increased the growth forecast of Venezuela. That is done before the elections. That was done before the elections. And the growth dynamics of Venezuela depends to a greater extent of the oil prices and conditions of exporting the oil. So what is it if when you observe an increase in world oil prices, and that is behind our growth forecast for Venezuela? How can the political situation of Venezuela affect that? It's a bit early to see how the conflict will be solved and what may happen and what is the migration flow, because still there's nothing concrete, and we would need to wait on how the growth dynamics continue and political transition occurs. Thank you very much, Daniel Titelman. Thank you to the journalists and media that have been with us in such a significant manner, both in person as well as through the digital platforms open for interaction with them on this occasion. Unfortunately, time is short. That is, we have reached the limit, but that, however, we need to recognize and commit. Recognize that those that have sent questions and commit in order to deliver in writing the answers to questions that we have been unable to raise live in the conference. We will respond the answers of Emma Cantizana, economist of Salvador, Fernando Morales, Mirta Rodriguez from La Estrella Panamá, Sebastián Osorio from Bloomberg, Marillena Costa in Santo Domingo, María del Carmen Guille from Diario Libre, Dominican Republic. So during today, we will send to you in writing the answers to your questions. Executive Secretary, when concluding this launch of this flagship conference, you have the floor for final thoughts. Yes, thank you. Reiterate thanks to Daniel Titelman, Economic Development Division of ECLAC, to all the colleagues. As you see, this report addresses several central subjects. We've placed an emphasis in what we call the low growth capacity trap. Remember, Latin America had better times in the first decade of this century. It was one of well-being and goodness for all of Latin America, South America. But after the financial crisis with the shock cascade and the pandemic, but not only as a result of the pandemic, it's something structural since 2012, 13, or 14, the last decade. The subject is how to get out of this low growth trap that will help come out of other traps as well. How to avoid a third lost decade. And of course, all of this linked with the employment subject chapter, very important one. Once again, considering formality, informality, quality of employment, sectoral issues, and productive structure, and link this to a relatively new subject, climate change, that unfortunately is here to stay. Hopefully, the efforts of the international community of verification will be successful. I mean, or rather, be sufficient, be enough, those efforts to take this planet out of this warming path. But we are already in a path of impacts, climate impacts, that will oblige us to make additional efforts. And all of this in order, how can we create employment, have better capacities of mitigation and adaptation to improve the quality of life? All the subject of productive development linked to education and macroeconomic subjects. It is a macroeconomic survey focusing on classical issues of the economy for development or development economy, with a view that we need to have, that is vision in 2024. Thank you very much. Thank you, José Manuel Salazar-Xirinachs, Executive Secretary of this Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you to all the media with us in this conference and launch. And reiterate, all the material associated to this launch are already available in the webpage of our Economic Commission. And as always, the Public Information Unit is available to all of you, media and journalists, to respond or answer any other requirement or question. With your authorization, then, Executive Secretary, we conclude this conference. Thank you very much. See you soon.